India's general election, the world's largest, is now a month in and a fortnight away from its conclusion on June 4th. By the time the last ballot is counted, more than 500 million people will have made their voice heard on the country's future. The process itself is challenging. Ballots are being cast in remote Himalayan towns, busy metropolises, and jungle villages. Election officials travel on foot, by road, by train, and sometimes even on the back of elephants to reach voters where they live. A bigger challenge, perhaps, at this stage in the vote has been turnout. The most recent phase saw only 2/3 of eligible voters show up. But while voters may appear a little bit absent, the politicians themselves have a very large presence indeed. The two main rivals are Prime Minister Narendra Modi's governing Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, in power now for 10 years, and the India National Development Inclusive Alliance, referred to as India, which is made of 26 parties, including the leading opposition party, Indian National Congress. The BJP-led coalition, the NDA, has the lead, but the scale of its success is by no means assured. Welcome to the Year of Elections, a podcast series brought to you by the Opinion Desk at The National. I'm Sulaiman Hakemy, The National's opinion editor, speaking to you from our studio here in Abu Dhabi. In the first episode on the Indian elections, we broke down the details of the voting process. And in this episode, we'll get into the issues at stake, what explains the voter turnout, and what the results of the vote might mean for India in the years to come. We're joined today from New York by Johan Chacko, who is the National's South Asia columnist, and from Delhi by Arti Jarath, a veteran journalist and political commentator. So, Arti, we'll start with you. I mean, we're talking about the biggest democratic election in the world happening right now in India. Could you just give us an overview of the key players, the main political parties, for those who are unfamiliar with Indian politics, and who are the kind of superstar candidates that we should be thinking about in this election?
This is a crucial election for India because Prime Minister Narendra Modi is seeking a third term. He's been in power 2 terms and he's now seeking a third term. He heads the Bharatiya Janata Party, which today is the largest and most dominant party in India. And pitted against him is a coalition of many parties, 26, I think, altogether, of which the Congress Party, which is the other national party, is the largest. So they call themselves India, and the Congress is the largest party in this, and the rest are mainly regional parties from, say, states like Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Delhi, Punjab, and so on. So basically, the election is now a bipolar election because they've tried to make sure that it's one BJP candidate against one candidate put up by India. So that's where we stand. And I mean, the issue, what is really happening is the way the campaign has unfolded. There doesn't seem to be any real issue for some strange reason. We're seeing this as an issueless election. And the only real issue is whether Prime Minister Modi should get a third term or whether he should be some other, maybe the India coalition should get an opportunity. The problem is that while Prime Minister Modi is a very dominant and charismatic face and has been leading India for the last 10 years, India doesn't have any such face. They have not projected a prime ministerial candidate. I mean, they've got these regional leaders who are very powerful and who are charismatic, but they are charismatic in their own states. They don't have a kind of pan-Indian acceptability. The only pan-Indian party in that is Congress. And Rahul Gandhi, for the last 2 elections, he has led the Congress party against Narendra Modi. And each time the Congress party has done its worst ever in its entire history in the last 2 elections. So although he has tried to reinvent himself with this huge walkathon through India, where he walked more than 4,000 kilometers, actually, from south to north and then from east to west, which has helped to reinvent him to some extent. But he simply doesn't seem to be a match, really, for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So I think that's where we stand at the moment.
Sure. Johan, I thought it was pretty interesting what Arti said about this being an issueless election, despite it being so bipolar. Do you agree with that assessment? And why do you think that might be?
I think it only appears issueless in part because of the chilling effect that some of the dominance of the BJP and it's the way in which it's used its dominance to assert control over public narratives, especially in public spaces, it's chilled, I think, to a certain extent, the normally vibrant kind of debate that you see in the media. But there are very real issues that I think are on the minds of voters, even if they're not articulated in the media. The first, I think, is in some ways the goal that Prime Minister Modi has set for himself, which is 370 seats. In other words, a 2/3 majority in the national legislature, which would then give him the power to modify the constitution. The constitution has been a very stable kind of thing. And it's in some ways, it represented a social contract that had a very broad and deep level of consensus. So in some ways, voters are asking themselves, do we really want to change the underlying consensus by which India is governed? It seems unlikely that he'll hit the 370 mark, however much he wants to. And that itself will be a big thing. So even if he does get his third term, if he doesn't get that 2/3 majority, it's an implicit check on his ambitions and his power. The second thing that is, I think, an underlying issue is urban youth unemployment. Now, India's economy has grown rapidly since COVID. It's well on its way to becoming the third largest economy in the world, something that I've written about. But at the same time, that growth has been highly unequal. The International Labour Organization just put out a report talking about this fundamental persistent problem with generating employment, especially for young college graduates in urban areas. Now, these kind of people are at the core of Mr. Modi's demographic, people who are enthusiastic about this new India that's going to be created. Now, if he's not delivering for them, there are indications that there is, some unhappiness about this failure to deliver. So they may not turn out. They may not vote for other people, but they may not turn out. And this may be a factor in the depressed turnout. On the other hand, the BJP has also significantly expanded the welfare state. Now, that's something that the earlier Congress government had started to do. And so there's a bet that women voters in particular, who actually have favored Mr. Modi, in part because of these kind of welfare subsidies that help households make it from month to month without crisis, with a greater sense of security. The question is that enough to bring them out to vote for Mr. Modi? So all of these things are up. And in many ways, these are about the fundamental ways in which India is run and where people think it's going.
Arti, do you think there's wide appeal, rather, at the grassroots level about these issues? How aware are average Indians, or how plugged in are they to these debates? And what is the opposition saying in response to the BJP's view of the Constitution?
Look, on the issue of the Constitution, it's become a controversy because the Prime Minister, in his last speech in Parliament, had said, he had spoken very confidently about coming back and said that there will be big decisions. Now, he left it unstated what he meant by big decisions. But once he raised the slogan of 370 for the BJP and 400, more than 400, what we call 400 par, more than 400 for the NDA, his alliance, the National Democratic Alliance, which is basically led by the BJP. And it's, again, an alliance of about 20 really tiny parties across India. So when the elections just began, at that time, a few senior BJP leaders had said that voters must give the BJP 400 seats, the NDA 400 seats, so that we can change the constitution, which the opposition pounced on and said that the BJP wants to change the constitution because the RSS has never believed in the constitution. And one of the first things they're going to do is take away the promised reservation policy under which 22% of government jobs and seats in government-run educational institutions are reserved for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, that is the Dalits and tribal communities. So obviously this created a lot of fear and misgivings amongst people. But the Prime Minister and his lieutenant, who's the Home Minister, Amit Shah, they have both repeatedly denied this charge and repeatedly denied that they have any intention of changing the constitution. So whether they are going to change the constitution or not change the constitution, I mean, this is up in the air, really. And it's a debate which at the moment does not seem to have any real basis. They have changed a lot of things in the last 5 years, even without the kind of majority that they're hoping to get this time. After all, they did strike down the special status for the state of Jammu and Kashmir and bring it under central rule. They did introduce a Citizenship Amendment Act whereby Hindus from neighboring countries, their application for citizenship can be fast-tracked, but not Muslims from neighboring countries. So they've done a lot of things in the last 5 years, even without that kind of majority. So this is, I think, a debate which we really cannot at the moment say whether, it has any basis or it's just something that the opposition has pounced on to try and put the BJP on the defensive. As far as the other issues go, which Johan talked about, I mean, he's very right. I think unemployment is a critical issue at the top of people's minds. I think price rise, food inflation is another critical issue at the top of people's minds. I think the sort of lack of investment in creating educational infrastructure, skill development infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, this is also an issue that's at the top of people's minds. But whether these issues will actually dictate their voting choices, I'm really not sure. Because election after election, when we go out into the countryside and talk to people, I mean, these are almost like perennial issues in every Indian election, because after all, we are a country which is still fairly steeped in poverty. And although we have made great strides, it's really basically the top 10% that has benefited, whereas the bottom 20% remains more or less, where they were earlier. So I don't know, but these are issues that dictate voting choices. And that's why when I said an issueless election, I mean, if we were to look at the last two elections, which, Prime Minister Narendra Modi won handsomely, in 2014, the issue really was about kicking the previous Manmohan Singh government out and bringing in change. And Narendra Modi was seen as the harbinger of that change, somebody who would change India, make it more modern, take it forward, bring in what he called Achhe Din, that is good days, and so on. And in 2019, the dominant theme of that election was nationalism. Elections happened immediately after a terrorist strike on paramilitary convoy in Jammu and Kashmir, in which about 40, 50 soldiers were killed. And in retaliation, India did an airstrike inside Pakistan, apparently to bomb terrorist training camps in that country. So the issue really was nationalism, national security. Modi was seen as a strong leader who would do whatever is necessary to protect the country from its enemies. So I don't see any of that kind of issue in these elections. And increasingly, the elections are becoming much more localized, where the old factors like caste and community are beginning to come into play. And I mean, possibly the voters are going to decide, depending on their affinity to the caste and community of the candidates of the two main formations that are contesting these elections. So in that sense, it's an issueless election, or maybe, should I say, a more normal election, Indian style, where you're looking at that factors like caste, community, region, language, things like that. So there is no pan-Indian issue that is running through these elections.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, I think, to my next question. I mean, Johan, can you tell us a little bit about what role do the states, look, India is comprised of many states. It's an incredibly diverse country. It's an incredibly disparate country as well. So tell us about the role of state politics in this election.
One of the important things to understand is that for the most part, state elections are held out of sequence with elections for the national legislature. So what that means is that these various governments are entrenched in various states, and those state governments control issues like policing, health, delivery of a lot of basic services. So in some ways, they set the atmosphere for the general elections. And people, if they're happy with the performance of whatever party is in charge of the state, they may be more predisposed to voting for candidates for that party for the general elections. And this is one place where India, the Indian National Developmental Inclusive Alliance.
Thank you. I'd completely forgotten what that acronym stands for.
Well,
it's not the most natural.
It's a very strange acronym, I think we can agree.
Yeah. One of the places where they have made gains actually has been at the state level. So they've won in Jharkhand, they got a big win in Karnataka, but also at an alliance level, they've managed to pull in regional parties that has helped them to gain control in Maharashtra, which is a major state, which is where Bombay is, and Bihar. These are all large states. So the question of why these parties, the big parties like the Congress and the BJP need regional parties has a lot to do with language, in part. There is a Hindi heartland that is 40%, 50% of the country, but then there's many states where the regional identity is built around language that's extremely strong, and politics are very local. But even in parts of the so-called Hindi heartland, there are places where the caste politics are complicated enough and where class politics are complicated enough that, for example, Bihar, where really its local parties have a strong edge. Now, one of the things that the BJP has done within the NDA, the National Democratic Alliance, over time is that it's tried to absorb local parties or steal successful politicians from local parties so that it can directly compete without relying on alliance members. So in that sense, the BJP has become a bigger and bigger share of the NDA, while with India, which formerly used to be called the UPA until last year, the United Progressive Alliance, the Congress has been shrinking within the alliance, even though the alliance has been growing. So in that sense, they're two very different models, and each of them actually represents something more profound, which is a model of how the center and the state are going to connect to each other, right? With the BJP, it's a very centralized, increasingly, there's a top-down vision, whereas the Congress vision, by necessity or design, it seems to be more confederal with more powers to the states. So that's also something for people to keep in mind, especially if regional identity matters.
Right. So, Arti, let's have a look at the current moment in this election. I mean, we're now several weeks in. We're recording this on May 15th. So where are we at right now? How many phases have already been carried out? What's left? And what are the early indications so far, if any, of results?
We have finished 4 phases of the scheduled 7 phases. I have forgotten exactly how many seats that covers, but it's more than half. We're near the 2/3 mark. And polling is complete now for the 5 southern states. So South India has voted completely. Now we are basically left with North India and East India, which is East India being the states of West Bengal and Orissa, which are left. And North India, of course, is the crucial states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which together account for 120 Lok Sabha seats. And Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, these are the states where the BJP won big time in the last 2 elections and actually have been the backbone of the BJP's victory at the center. So the next 3 phases are very critical to determine whether the BJP can hold on to its fortresses. Whatever gains it had to make in the last 4 phases, largely. I mean, I'm talking very broadly. And now it's a question of holding on to what it won last time. So that's basically where we're at. Very difficult to say really what the trends are because, as I said, since there doesn't seem to be any clear wave in favor of one or the other, There doesn't seem to be one dominant issue that the election revolves around. It's very difficult to really judge who's ahead and who's winning, who's losing. However, the hallmark of these elections is the low voter turnout, which suggests a kind of lack of enthusiasm in the elections, maybe a lack of enthusiasm in the choices that voters have been given, maybe the lack of enthusiasm because there is no emotive issue that they are being asked to vote on. So by and large, the last four phases have seen a dip from 2 to 5% compared to 2019. And that's introduced a lot of lively debate on, does a low turnout favor the incumbent or does a low turnout favor the challenger? And there's no consensus on who's favored by this low turnout.
Sure.
So we will continue to debate for the next three phases. The only good thing is that the last phase, the one that has just concluded, the fourth phase, saw the highest turnout of the four phases. So we're hoping that maybe some enthusiasm is coming back into the electorate, which may pull them out to the booths. Unfortunately, the weather is getting very hot, and we are now heading into like the peak of summer, and that is likely to depress voter turnout further.
Johan, if we're talking about enthusiasm among the voters, I mean, one of the, I suppose, more interesting aspects of this election has been a campaign finance scandal that has dominated a lot of the news coverage. I mean, could you tell us about this scandal? Basically, what happened and how has it affected the BJP and perhaps voter sentiment as well?
So first of all, let me take a step back and say that India, and in fact, most of South Asia, has a huge problem with campaign financing. Elections are highly competitive and the stakes are high. And so what that means is that elections are expensive, and there weren't really very good mechanisms for parties to legally raise funds. And so that created a lot of space for bribery and illegality, an entire black market economy around campaign financing. The BJP in 2017 introduced this scheme called electoral bonds, which they claimed would basically bring this all out into the open and regularize and regulate it. Unfortunately, the scheme was completely opaque. Essentially, in particular, corporate sponsors were now allowed to give an unlimited amount of funds through the purchase of these bonds through the State Bank of India. But here's the thing. The companies were not required to disclose how much they gave to each party. That information wasn't even shared with the Electoral Commission of India. So it was utterly opaque. It received a number of challenges. Some of them were from citizens. And then one challenge was actually by the Communist Party of India, which basically argued that it was unconstitutional, that it deprived voters of the most fundamental information that they need to make an informed decision. The Supreme Court hesitated to take it on, but finally by 2022, it looked like the petition against the electoral bonds was making real headway. And so in February of this year, the Supreme Court struck down the bonds as unconstitutional on the grounds that the Communist Party had argued. And then the following month, this is the really big thing, they ordered the State Bank of India to disclose who had bought bonds. And the State Bank of India did that, and the Supreme Court really pushed it and forced them to fully disclose this data. And it basically emerged that one of the largest purchases of electoral bonds was this rather shady sort of casino company. This pattern seemed to emerge where companies that had been in trouble with federal law enforcement seemed to have their cases go away. It didn't look very good. And I think that it opened up a little bit of a crack in the kind of good guy image, the good governance image that the BJP had really fostered, that they were the anti-corrupt. So really a big part of the wave that propelled them was this desire for fundamental change where Indian politics would become cleaner, governance would become cleaner and more efficient. And the Congress was presented as the party of corruption, and the BJP was presented as the party of clean, the party of efficiency, the party of growth. And now all of that seems a bit more muddled because there's no question about what's happened here. The other thing that I would say is that it's also, at a more subtle level, demonstrated that the BJP does not, in fact, control all the levers of power. I should have mentioned this. It wasn't just the Communist Party that lodged a petition with the Supreme Court against the electoral bond scheme. Even the Electoral Commission of India lodged a petition. So you have major institutions in India going against the government and winning. So in many ways, that this is a very good indicator of the health of Indian democracy. It isn't dead, as people claim. It isn't completely in the hands of the ruling party. So I think that in itself is a useful signal to voters. There has been a lot of discussion about what really are the ethics of the BJP's governance. And I think that's opened up a little bit more media space for questioning in ways that before this, I think, much harder to do.
Okay, and I have one last question for both of you. So, Johan, I'll just start with you and then we'll close with Arti. But given where we're at and everything that's happened in this election, tell us about the future in your mind. I mean, what's at stake here for the future of India? However the results go, is Indian society going to change off the back of this election? Or is it more likely that the trends that are pervasive right now will continue? Johan?
I think that this is really a test of how far India is willing to accept Mr. Modi's vision. Because even if he returns for a third term, but it's a weaker hold on parliament or it's a more fragmented vote, that's going to place constraints on his ability to implement his agenda. On the other hand, if he does get his absolute majority, then this becomes a launching point for much more sweeping and radical change. So I think in that sense, this is a very important election.
Arti, do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're at the crossroads today. For the last 70 years, we have been used to liberal, secular framework in which our democracy, our government, our parliament, and all our other institutions function. What has happened over the last 10 years is that this framework has been increasingly challenged by the growth of the BJP, the majority that it won 10 years ago, and the RSS, that is the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. This is the kind of mentor of the BJP, the philosopher and guide of the BJP. And their vision basically is really to turn India into a Hindu country. I mean, their argument really is that Muslims were given a country in Pakistan, and therefore India should be a Hindu country. And the vision is very fundamentalist, it's very majoritarian. And we have seen some fairly ugly communal incidents in the last 10 years, not of the kind of big violence that we've seen in the past, but little things where Muslims have found themselves at the receiving end of the law. If they do something wrong, their houses get bulldozed and demolished. They have been attacked by vigilante groups which have accused them of selling beef or of stealing cattle or whatever charge the vigilante group has chosen to level. So the point is really, the choice for us today is that I think this is something that the opposition has tried to highlight in the election, but has not really been able to craft that narrative in very clear terms. That with a democracy, with a India, are we heading towards this majoritarian, right-wing, fundamentalist Hindu rule? Or are we going to preserve that secular, liberal, democratic framework in which we have functioned for so many decades? I think that is really the underlying issue of this election, which has not been articulated well enough by the opposition to challenge the BJP. However, what is interesting in these elections is that the BJP, and led by no less a person than the Prime Minister himself, the BJP has conducted a very polarizing campaign in which the kind of rhetoric that they have indulged in is basically to accuse the Congress of pandering to the minorities, of vote bank appeasement, and trying to scare Hindus that if the Congress comes to power, they will steal your wealth, they will steal your property and give it to Muslims. And the Prime Minister used a very emotive, stirring image in that, where he said that they would take away women's Mangal Sutra. Now, the Mangal Sutra for a married Hindu woman is the equivalent of a wedding ring. So he said that the Congress will take this away and give it to Muslims because of its vote bank politics, its minority appeasement policies, and so on. So I think it's from the BJP's rhetoric in this campaign that one gets an idea of which way India will head should Prime Minister Modi come back to term, even if it's with a smaller majority. But the very fact that he has a majority and he will be in power, he has shown us in 10 years that he knows how to operate these levers of governance to suit his politics. The way investigative agencies have been used against opposition leaders, with many of them facing corruption charges, the arrest of a sitting chief minister, the chief minister of Delhi in the middle of the election. So I think he's shown us that he's an expert at using these levers. And the point is to come back to power and be prime minister again. And his campaign gives us an insight into the kind of India that we would be if he were to come back.
That's it for today. Special thanks to our guests, Ardi Jarath and Johan Chako, our producers Doa Farid and Arthur Edison, and of course, to you, our listeners. And I've been your host, Sulaiman Hakemy. If you enjoyed this podcast, just a reminder to find future episodes on your favorite podcast app and hit subscribe.